We're excited to have Dr. Stein, the senior author on the paper, join us. He's a neuropathologist at the VA Boston Healthcare System. He's an assistant professor of neurology and laboratory medicine at Boston University School of Medicine. For all you folks from Wisconsin, he did his undergraduate and graduate work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's not only a medical doctor, but he's a PhD in neuroscience. We're very lucky that Dr. McKee recruited him to the team a decade ago. He's an award-winning scientist, and he has published many of the papers that that have come out of the Brain Bank. But if you haven't met him yet, you're going to be excited because he's also a wonderful presenter and a great guy. So, Dr. Stein, thank you so much for joining us to share your newest research.
Great, thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it, and I'm glad to be here. I hope this can, good opportunity to kind of show what we've been working on and doing the past couple of years here. So I'm going to share my screen here, bring up my presentation. So this is really new work that I've been doing that I started a number of years ago with a research assistant, Jason Adams, who was working in the lab. And as you'll see, it's an extension of some fantastic work that he did even earlier, published in 2018. And so Jason is with us today, and he's going to help me present some of these findings. So I'll bring him in kind of halfway through. Jason is now MD, PhD student over at the West Coast and University of California, San Diego. So really fortunate that he's been able to continue to work with us and to help us do some of this exciting research. So today I'm going to talk about our findings on a sleep disorder, REM sleep behavior disorder, and its association with years of contact sports play and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So ever since the beginning, really Chris and the BU team and others have really tried to figure out what are the kind of clinical symptoms that are associated with this disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And in looking at cases that have come to autopsy, we've generated a list of a number of different and sometimes very divergent symptoms, but ones that kind of fell into some main categories, right? So the big symptoms were cognitive, involved memory and at late stages dementia. But behavioral mood symptoms were also a pretty prominent feature that tended to occur early on. It involves some of the impulsivity and depression and anger that you've heard about. And then motor symptoms are kind of a feature that didn't happen in everybody, but some people developed some kind of Parkinson's-like features with slowness of movement and resting tremor. But you'll note at the very bottom of this list, even back, this was in 2017 that this was published in JAMA, but there was some sleep disturbances that have been noticed in a few cases. And it was put at the bottom because it wasn't common, but this is a pretty rare disease. And so it definitely, I think, raised the people's eyebrows and made people think. And so this is this rapid eye movement, or REM, behavior sleep disorder. So it had been noted to be present and to be one of the features that some folks with CTE had to suffer with in life. So what is this disease? Well, this is a sleep disorder that is basically a dysfunction of REM sleep. So normally when all of us sleep and go into REM sleep, a very important function of the brain, and particularly some sleep centers in the brainstem, which we'll get into a little bit later, are to paralyze your body. So to make it so that you cannot act out the dreams and the things that you're thinking about during REM sleep, because it's a time of really intensive mental activity. And so in this disorder, that paralysis doesn't happen, or doesn't happen fully. And so folks will act out these dreams, and they often are very vivid, nightmare type dreams that have a lot of emotional content, and the acting out can vary in severity. So depending on, you know, if you're running in the dream, if you're in a fight in the dream, there may be punching. And so it can really vary in how severe it happens. But if it is severe, it can lead to injury, not only of the patient, but of his bed partner. And so that's often how these disorders come to medical attention. It leads to an injury during sleep. Of course, it can disrupt sleep itself, and the very act of disrupting sleep is not, you know, is not good for your health as well. So I'm not a neurologist, I'm a pathologist, but I will just kind of go over what the current recommendations are for treating this disorder. It's still not really well understood what causes this and what are the underlying mechanisms, and therefore there are no curative treatments, but there are some things that can be done to help treat some of the symptoms. So the first thing is really to rule out other causes of this disease. And there are some medications, particularly antidepressants, that have been linked to REM sleep behavior disorder and that can cause it. So if they're present, you might want to, you want to switch those out or stop those. And then, just some common sense measures. You want to establish a safe sleeping environment, so to prevent those kinds of injuries, padding and things of that like. And then there are some medications that have been shown to help in some cases. So these include, and really the first line is melatonin. This is a supplement. It's a natural hormone produced by the brain that is important for sleep cycle regulation, and it's generally safe. So that's kind of the first go-to. Other medication that has been shown to help is a low-dose clonazepam. That can help, but has more side effects, and so that can be limiting. And then there are a handful of studies and a small number of groups have shown that other medications may help, and these include things like cholinesterase inhibitors and some other things. All right, so what is known about the kind of the underlying mechanisms or the pathologies that may lead to this disease? Well, generally, folks with REM sleep behavior disorder are associated with Parkinson's disease. And so they're more likely to have Parkinson's disease and then to have the underlying pathology of Parkinson's disease, which is Lewy body pathology. And it's thought, and it's noted in those individuals, they have Lewy bodies, particularly in part of the brain that is involved in these sleep regulation and REM sleep regulation, and that's the brainstem. And so the brainstem is present here at the base of the brain. It has a number of functions, including connecting the brain to the spinal cord. And there are a number of sleep regulation centers that are present, particularly in the pons and in the midbrain. And in those folks with Parkinson's disease who also suffer from REM sleep behavior disorder, they'll often have Lewy bodies that are present in these nuclei that then lead to the loss of connections of cells and the death of cells, and that is thought to be the way that the sleep disorder manifests. Now, there has been previous work that has linked particularly mild to severe traumatic brain injury with the development of this disorder. In particular, a TBI with a significant amount of loss of consciousness, so something that's significant enough to cause you to lose consciousness for a period of time, has been linked with an increased frequency of having REM sleep behavior disorder. And this was a paper published in Neurology back in 2012. And studies have also linked TBI, again, a moderate to severe TBI with loss of consciousness, in the development of Lewy body disease. So folks who have had, have reported even one of these more significant types of TBI have a slightly increased risk of developing Lewy body disease, including in brainstem nuclei that are close by and to those sleep centers. But nobody has, so there's clear link with TBI, but we didn't really know if milder forms of traumatic brain injury, such as concussion or even the subconcussive hits that you can get repetitively over many years in contact sports, if that may also lead to increased risk for developing this pathology and this disease. There were some clues though, and this is the study that Jason and I published 2 years ago now, where we looked at 2 different groups of people. We looked at athletes and we looked at a community-based aging population from the Framingham Heart Study, and found that in both groups, the years of play was associated with increased risk for developing Lewy bodies, and particularly developing cortical Lewy bodies, which leads ultimately to dementia and severe problems with thinking. And so this was really the first study to link years of play with the development of this kind of Lewy body pathology. And in particular, we did a kind of an analysis to figure out, well, how is there some kind of threshold years of play? And this is all limited, because we're looking at after death, and these cohorts are very different. But in general, we found that 8 years was a good cutoff, a cutoff that if you played more than 8 years, your risk of developing these Lewy bodies was significantly greater than if you played less than that. And that's fairly consistent with the number of years that have been suggested to increase your risk for CTE as well. So knowing this, Jason and I had a few hypotheses. So we thought that because contact sports play increase your risk of developing Lewy body disease, and REM sleep behavior disorder is one of those symptoms that had been noted in CTE, that the years of play would also be predictive of REM sleep behavior disorder. We thought that Lewy body pathology then would probably be the pathology that underlied that disease. Although we also wanted to test, because CTE is really a disease of tau, of the tau protein, we wanted to test whether that tau pathology might also be a mechanism that underlies the presence of REM sleep behavior disorder. So those are the things we set out to test. And so to do that, we looked at our group of brain bank donors, and we selected, we started this study a couple of years ago now. So at that time, we selected those people who had come to autopsy and had received a neuropathological diagnosis of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And there were 363 of those individuals. And so, and then of those 363, 261 had their significant others, usually spouses, sometimes other close family members, had been asked through a questionnaire whether they had problems with sleep, and in particular, whether they had these symptoms of REM sleep behavioral disorder, which is, did they act out their dreams during sleep? And then we excluded a few cases of some rare types of neurodegenerative diseases that could also be associated with REM sleep behavior disorder. And that left us with a total of 247 former athletes with CTE. And what we found right away is, just looking at those individuals, 80 of them had this REM sleep behavior disorder. So this really, really kind of surprised us. This is 30% of the whole cohort had RBD. And this is 30 times more than what's reported in the general population, where it's been estimated that this is, present maybe in about 1% of people just generally. So really is a much more frequent disorder associated with CTE than I think we expected, and suggests that, if you go back to that first slide where REM sleep is really at the bottom of the list, that at the very least that should be bumped up a little bit. It's a more frequent disorder than had been previously, I think, appreciated. So then we went in to test, to specifically look at associations between those people with REM sleep behavior disorder and those without, and test our hypotheses. And I'm going to let Jason Adams take over here and talk about the specific associations that we found. So Tyler, if you could put Jason up, and Jason, why don't you take it away here? Let me know how to advance.
All right, thanks, Thor. So yeah, to start with, so what we want to do is we have our two groups of individuals. We have those folks who have no REM-sleep behavior disorder, and then those who do. And so what we tested initially as our first hypothesis was that these folks with REM-sleep behavior disorder would be found to have played more years of contact sports in the past. And so we could see over here on the left side of the screen is that was in fact the case. Is that individuals who were found to have REM-sleep behavior disorder had played for significantly more years of play than those who did not have the symptoms that are characteristic of the disorder. However, we found that in both groups of individuals had started playing sports at about the same age. So it just seemed like the folks with REM-sleep behavior disorder had played for a longer amount of time. One thing that we did observe though is, so then we wanted to see whether or not there was any difference in if the groups distributed differently in terms of how they had played what sport they had played, to see whether or not there might be, if we might hypothesize any sort of mechanistic difference. And what we found is that the two groups distributed equally in the sport that they were playing. So it really seemed to be more than anything just the folks with REM-sleep behavior disorder had played for a longer number of years than those without. Can we have the next slide? So then, having found out that the REM-sleep behavior disorder group of individuals had played for a longer number of years, we then wanted to identify whether or not there was any sort of pathology that we would expect to be underlying the disorder. And based on our work in the past, we thought in the other common pathologies of the disorder, we looked first at Lewy body disease. And so what we've done here over the next few slides is that we've included kind of this pie chart to make it a little bit easier to follow along with the analysis that's happening in the figure. So this is comparison, just looking strictly at people with all those people with with REM-sleep behavior disorder in comparison to those without. And what we found is that in the group with REM-sleep behavior disorder symptoms, these individuals had a higher frequency of Lewy body pathology than those without. And we've also included some images down here on the left to kind of give you an example of what we look for when we're looking for Lewy body pathology. And then can we have the next table? And so when we found that there was this increased frequency of cases with Lewy body pathology in the REM-sleep behavior disorder, we then wanted to see whether or not there was any type of, oh yes, I see your comment there. Yes, I'll speak more slowly. So having noticed that in the group with REM-sleep behavior disorder, having noticed that there's an increased frequency of Lewy body pathology in these cases, we then sought to distinguish whether or not there's any type of difference in the stage of Lewy body disease that these individuals had. And so how Lewy body disease is ordinarily staged is there's different regions of the brain that it's thought can be more susceptible to developing Lewy body disease or having Lewy bodies found there. And after these places get affected, it's then thought it's to kind of transmits to other part of the brain. And with the idea being that later stage individuals would be more likely to have neocortical pathology, whereas earlier stage Lewy body disease would be more kind of brainstem in the olfactory regions. And so we wanted then to find out whether or not that, based on our past work, if the individuals with REM-sleep behavior disorder, whether or not any types of brain regions would have almost a predilection for Lewy body pathology. But we didn't see this in our cases. So it seemed that although there was an increased frequency of Lewy body cases, so more individuals with Lewy body pathology itself, there didn't seem to be any difference in how that pathology was distributed, at least in the regions that we looked at. And so one of the most interesting things that we observed is that even though REM-sleep behavior disorder is associated with synuclein pathology, and we see this increased frequency of Lewy body pathology in our cohort of cases with REM-sleep behavior disorder, what was surprising to us that we found is that most of these individuals didn't have with REM sleep behavior disorder didn't have this Lewy body pathology. It was more than 2/3, and yeah, so which is what we see here in this table, and which was very surprising to us because there's a very solid and strong link between synuclein pathology and REM sleep behavior disorder. So we then undertook a comparison. We excluded everybody in both cohorts. We excluded all individuals with Lewy body disease to identify and compare the groups of individuals with REM sleep behavior disorder, but without Lewy body disease, to those individuals also without Lewy body disease, but also who didn't have REM sleep behavior disorder. And so what we found is that although they still had a similar age of death, but what was interesting to us as well is that these individuals were still found to have played for a longer number of years than those without REM sleep behavior disorder. But then what we found is so now we looked at tau, because as Thor mentioned in the beginning, it's, we expect after the Lewy body pathology, we then wanted to see whether it would be kind of CTE tau, which often appears in the brainstem in the initial stages of CTE as well. So we looked at brainstem regions to see whether or not there would be a difference in the frequency of tau presenting in brainstem regions that we would expect to be associated with REM sleep behavior disorder. Namely, that was the raphe nuclei, which are midbrain and upper pontine regions of the brain that are thought to have a regulatory function over sleep and REM sleep behavior. And so what we found is that in the dorsal median raphe, which again are regions of the brain that are thought to regulate REM sleep, what we found is that there was in individuals with REM sleep behavior disorder, a higher percentage of these individuals were found to have tau pathology in these regions of the brain. However, we then looked at a number of other brain regions to see, brainstem regions, to see whether or not those regions would also have an increased frequency of tau. And so those regions that we looked at were the locus and the subceruleus, the substantia nigra, and the basis pontis. So the locus and the subceruleus have early involvement in CTE and also have been suggested to have some influence over REM sleep with some of the neurons in those areas. And in addition, we looked at substantia nigra because it's the most common site that a person would expect to find Parkinson's pathology. And as you'll recall from Dr. Stein's introductory portion, the REM sleep behavior disorder we would expect to find very highly associated with Parkinson's disease. And then in addition, we want to look at other regions in the pons to see whether or not the tau that we had observed as being higher in frequency in the raphe nuclei was observable in another region of the pons. In all of these regions, however, in contrast to the dorsal and median raphe nuclei, in these other regions, we found that the frequency of tau distributed equally between those participants with REM sleep behavior disorder and those without.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jason. So, so as Jason mentioned, it was really the raphe nucleus where we saw this difference in tau pathology in those individuals with the sleep disorder. And this is a microscopic image, about 24 times magnification, showing that raphe nucleus that's highlighted by this circle here. And the pink is really showing areas where there are cells, neurons and supporting cells, and the blue staining shows then the connections, the tracks between the cells. And so this area had lost some neurons, and in particular had more tau pathology in those people with the sleep disorder. So this is a higher magnification image showing that same nucleus, and you can see here now the neurons present within the raphe. This is an individual with REM sleep behavior disorder who did not have any alpha-synuclein or Lewy body pathology. It was negative for that, but instead had really abundant tau pathology. And you know, as you may recall, if you've seen past webinars, you've seen Dr. McKee speak, the tau is a protein that's normally part of the axon, and it is part of the skeleton of the axon. It's really important for maintaining the structure of those cells. But what we see in this pathology is that it is no longer present in the axon, and instead gets concentrated and builds up within the cytoplasm of the cell, and is associated with the loss of connections then of that cell, and ultimately with the death of cells. And so we think that this tau pathology is disrupting the function of these cells and maybe leading to the loss of them, and then that may underlie some of the issues with with mediating paralysis during REM sleep, and then leading to the sleep disorder. All right, so taking all of this, a final part of the paper, we wanted to kind of construct or test a model where we took all of the things that we found and other people have found to be significant predictors of developing REM sleep behavior disorder. And when we ran that model in this group of former athletes with CTE, what we found is that the biggest predictor was, in fact, the development of tau pathology in the RAF-A. That increased the odds of the likelihood that you had REM sleep behavior disorder by 4-fold, and was the most significant factor. Second, after that, was the development of Lewy body disease. So they were the presence of Lewy body disease did make it more likely that they would also have REM sleep behavior disorder, as you might expect. And then I think, interestingly, even independent of these two pathologies, of the tau pathology, of the Lewy body pathology, we found that the years of contact sports play also predicted a slightly increased risk of developing REM sleep behavior disorder. So what this suggests is that actually that there are other mechanisms at play that aren't the tau pathology, that aren't the Lewy body pathology, things that we aren't able to currently see or test. That may be also playing a role in mediating the development of this disorder. These things likely may include actually damage to the cell itself, damage to the axons from the repetitive head impacts, and may also include things like inflammation that we know can persist in the brain after multiple repetitive impacts. So these are things, I think, for future studies to try to tease apart and to try to get a better sense of, and then hopefully develop some diagnostics and therapies around. The other thing I think that this is important and suggests is that just because you have had maybe this history of REM sleep behavior disorder and have played a contact sport does not necessarily mean that you have CTE, right? So there is this risk of the contact sports play alone in the absence of the tau pathology. So I think that there's still a lot we need to figure out, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that the CTE pathology is going to be there. We still don't know that for sure. So just to conclude, what we've tried to test and show in the study and present to you here today, the first thing is that REM sleep behavior disorder is common in CTE. About a third of folks in our brain donation group had complained of this disease in life, and so that's something that I think both athletes and their doctors need to be aware of and to think about. Second, we showed this kind of dose response effect where years of play seem to be a significant predictor of the development of this disease. So, I think going forward, the idea is if you can limit that, better either safer play or limiting the number of years can maybe really make a big dent in the development of some of these disorders. And then, in CTE, I think it's kind of a little bit surprising. We found that it's not the Lewy body pathology that you typically see in REM sleep behavior disorder, at least those that are associated with Parkinson's disease. And instead, it's more likely to be a tau pathology that seems to underlie the development of the disorder. And finally, that the repetitive head impacts are causing some changes on their own that we don't yet understand, but may be linked to axonal injury, inflammation, and other mechanisms that I think will be important as we move forward to try to delineate, figure out, and find ways that we can detect those both in life for diagnoses and then hopefully develop some treatments and therapies. So with that, I just note, this study was supported by multiple grants from the NIH, from the VA, the Concussion Legacy Foundation, of course, has supported this research from the very beginning and continues to be really important in enabling what we do and making this information available to the public at large. Huge, thank you and acknowledgement to all of the families and the donors who have agreed to participate in this study. I mean, there's no small thing, and without that, we would not be here. We would not be able to say the things that we've done, to say the findings that we've had. So we're very appreciative of that. And then finally, this is just the summary of the paper that came out just today. And just to note, it's a huge team effort. A lot of people were involved in this, and so we're very thankful to all the folks in the team at BU, and including collaborations with Mayo Clinic and CLF, and so just very, very appreciative. And with that, I'll end, and I think we'll take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Stein. Very well presented. Thank you, Jason Adams. Nice job. A round of applause virtually for Dr. Stein. Really nice job with the paper. So we do have a lot of questions, and so I will help walk through them. And we'll start with some complicated science ones. We'll sort of work down to some of the bigger picture questions, which are always on our mind about the future of CT research. Just worth noting for the handful of you who might have read my book, Head Games, back in 2006, when I first was working on this, one of the symptoms that I developed with post-concussion syndrome, literally a symptom that knocked me out of wrestling because I had a REM behavior disorder episode, was that I developed this after my concussions. And the good news is that the actual brain injury I suffered is likely the mechanism for it being caused, although it still exists to this day. And so living through it, I can tell you this is not a benign symptom by any stretch of the imagination. Like, you are a danger to yourself, you are a danger to others. And imagine, I've got 2 young kids now, and I'm scared to death when they are anywhere near the bed where I'm sleeping, just because I can sometimes not differentiate dreams from reality. And so it's unfortunate this is a finding with CTE. I'm very sympathetic to all the families, and especially the spouses who've had to deal with this. But hopefully this will help us better understand treatment going forward. So, and just as a plug, I noticed I have my brain donation card on my desk. So you want to support this sort of incredible research, we'll put the link up to pledge your brain if you haven't yet, but I would be honored if my brain was able to contribute to this sort of work. So I want to start with a question from our advisory board member from Chicago, Dr. Sam Sasodi, has put in a few questions, so I appreciate you joining us. So Dr. Sasodi primarily works on Alzheimer's disease, but we're trying to recruit him into CTE. One of those questions was, how are you defining tau pathology? Basically, what are the morphological characteristics of abnormal tau? That's a good place to start.
Yeah, great question. So we're using the 88 antibody, which is a commonly used antibody that recognizes tau phosphorylated at certain sites and also in conformational stage. So it's widely used. I'm sure Sam knows, widely used for Alzheimer's disease. So that's kind of what we used, and then defining basically the accumulation of that protein in the cytoplasm. So it's like in the tangles or in the neurites that you see, kind of as I showed in that figure. So that's the definition that we're using.
And follow-up question is, how do you envision development of therapeutics targeting tau pathology and axonal injury? Big question, but curious what's on your mind.
That's a huge
short
question.
answer.
And I'm very hopeful that we can take advantage of all of the excellent work that's been done in Alzheimer's disease on this. So Alzheimer's, we don't have to go through the whole history, but it's really been all amyloid focused. But in the past last, I don't know, 10 years, it's really been tau focused. And there are a lot of tau compounds that I know are in the works, that are in clinical trials. And so my hope anyway is that that some of those will pan out, and that we can, and that will then be useful not only for Alzheimer's disease, but for CTE. So that's the hope.
Yeah. So Lane asked, and it's an interesting question, is the data disaggregated by sex? Simple answer, when we're talking about athletes, CT has not been seen in a female athlete yet, but primarily because we don't get a lot of female brain donations. So we've been working very hard to get female brain donations. We have people like Michelle Akers and Brandy Chastain and legends of women's sports have pledged their brain, Andrew Ruggiero. Part of it is Title IX, aren't a lot of older women's sports. Part of it is that many didn't play football, but we are eager to learn about sex differences in CT, but we need those brains to do it, and we don't have them. Somebody asked, and this is an important thing to mention, they said, what years of playing sports are significant? So we talk about years of play driving this. I want to explain what that means in terms of sort of being age agnostic.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So we're just counting any year from peewee all the way to professional, and so we're not yet at the point where we're able to tease apart those differences, although we're very keen and interested to do so. Clearly, playing at a high school level is different from playing at the NFL level, and so most people, it's a progression. But there are a few folks who will only play at one end or the other. And so I think as we get more of those cases, we can kind of try to tease apart some of those differences. I think there's a difference in severity and how severe the hits are, but there's also a difference in brain development and integrity of the brain. We know that in kids, the brain is still developing. It's not probably fully developed, and myelination isn't complete until their 20s. So there's a lot of factors, I think, that we're just ignoring by saying years of play at this point, but that we really hope to really be able to dive into in the future.
Yeah, and I'm gonna actually push back a little bit on the idea that professionals that much different than youth, just because of what you started to say at the end there, which is with the lesser developed brain, it may take fewer hits to cause the same amount of damage, fewer and less severe hits. So I don't think it's good at any age, and there's a lot of reasons to think about that. Big picture
I'll just
question.
follow up. We have studies that show that that have come out of VU that that if you start playing before age 12, you do a lot worse on IQ, verbal IQ tests, and on developing symptoms early on than if you start after.
Yeah, big picture question that we're all of us who've been hitting the head too much are worried about. Are we close to finding a way to diagnose CTE in people that are alive? And how is this research driving that work?
Yeah, so there are a lot of folks on the clinical team who are really focused on that. Bob Stern has got a big multi-center study looking at that. It's a big part actually of our Alzheimer's Disease Center at Boston University that we just put in for a renewal. It's going to be a big focus. Our hope in looking at the pathology is, we can tell with a degree of precision exactly what regions of the brain are involved in at what point in the disease. And so we can kind of hone where to look for in your PET scans, what epitopes are involved. We have a number of studies coming up where we're looking at different tau epitopes that might be unique to CTE compared to other tauopathies, and how they may be tested in CSF or even in blood. I think there's a lot of different avenues where the pathology can kind of inform these biomarker and other living diagnostic tests.
Yeah, thank you. And a basic question, can you explain, because I don't use the term a lot, what is a Lewy body?
Yeah, good question. So a Lewy body is simply it's named after the neurologist, pathologist who described it, Lewy, and it's basically an inclusion within the cell that's made up of this protein called alpha-synuclein. And so it's a clumped up protein that has a very characteristic appearance under the microscope. And it's still not completely understood how it leads to dysfunction of the cell, but it's actually a protein that's really heavily produced in the synapse, so in the connections between the cells. And by the time you have that actual Lewy body, you've lost a lot of those connections. So the thought is that the loss of synapses has kind of focused and concentrated the protein into this inclusion. And it's really Lewy body disease, Parkinson's disease is really a loss of synapses, a loss of these connections of these cells. And the other point is, it has this predilection for different parts of the disease, different parts of the brain, and it really it focuses on those areas of the brain that are these hyperbranching. So, there's some studies that suggest neurons in your brainstem can have millions of connections in your brain, and so it's those cells that have so many connections are the ones that are really susceptible to losing those connections and developing Lewy bodies.
Thank you. So somebody's asking, how can you tell if you have REM sleep disorder without someone else telling you? And I think it's a hard question. I think the simple answer is you may not be able to tell that you're punching and kicking and flailing at night if it doesn't wake you up and you don't hit somebody else. But for me, like, I can tell because I wake up in a different room than where I went to sleep, and that would be a sign that the system in your brain that's supposed to keep you paralyzed is not working. But it also may be true that you may not know, and you need a sleep study. And I think a lot of this is interesting. A lot of questions around treatment for RBD, is question around MERT. I don't think we have any data on if tau pathology is causing RBD, how would you treat it or treat it differently? I think the simple answer is if you have a sleep disorder, there are sleep experts, I've worked with them, that can help you sleep better, right? And that's not our work. But I will say referrals are an area of expertise for this area that we need to build. And so for anybody who has any symptoms related to CTE or concussions that they're worried about or don't feel like they're getting the answers for, need referral help, or even want a mentor to talk to help them live with it, reach out to our helpline. We'll put the helpline in the chat. But we do want to help you one-on-one with any issues you're having. There's a question like that. Will we be doing any specific planned studies on people with RBD in CTE? I would say the answer is we don't know yet, right?
Yeah. No, I think this is still a rapidly developing area. I think we're just beginning to realize how important it is to focus on this, and my hope is that we will expand to be able to do those kinds of things, but it's going to take some time and work to do.
Do you know how frequently RBD behavior has to be shown to be considered RBD? Like nights per week? I mean, I think it can be rare. For me, it could be once or twice a month. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's variable, and there's no frequency that they use to define it. The gold standard is a sleep study, but like you said, it's infrequent, so you can't always catch it. That's why most people would just use this very simple Mayo questionnaire, that asks you, are you acting out your dreams, and have you
yeah, actually, in our follow-up email to this, where we're going to share the recording of this to everybody who registered, we'll also share that Mayo questionnaire. That would be a good idea. Let's see here. I've got to read questions as we go through here. Do you have any idea about the relationship between sleep apnea and CPAP and how it may complicate REM behavior disorder?
Oh, great question. I do not. But that is a very good question. How there's this whole connection between sleep apnea, as they're suggesting, and REM sleep behavior disorder, and sometimes the two can be confused. So I don't know what the role of CPAP would be in that. I mean, my guess is that if you have a component of sleep apnea, then CPAP is important. But if you don't, it's just REM sleep behavior disorder, then
I guess I can tell you from experience, I tried CPAP once because I was exploring whether some of my sleep problems were because of that. CPAP covers your face, and so for me, it would make me think I was choking to death and I'd rip it off. So there can be an interaction between those two things. So, but you do need, if you have sleep apnea, you do need treatment. There are other treatments for sleep apnea besides CPAP. So if there's an interaction, talk to your doctor. Good question here, and I think this is a great one, actually, for you to answer. So somebody, a teacher is asking, she had a severe concussion at age 58. She's 63, still has symptoms. Is she at risk for CTE? I would love to give some support here and say, no, that we don't think she is. Go ahead. Do you want to share what our understanding of single impact versus thousands of impacts are right now?
Yeah. So I mean, on our experience, a single concussion, even a single severe concussion, is not a risk for CTE. It's really the repetitive years of play, years of exposure to repetitive impacts that is the significant risk. We've tried to look for a link between concussions and CTE and have not seen that.
Yeah. Is there any evidence of REM behavior disorder in animal models of brain injury?
Good question. So a lot of the work that really identifies the brainstem sleep centers is based on animal studies, obviously, that can then manipulate those nuclei. But I don't know that it's been looked at specifically in impact models. So I'm not aware of the literature on that. It may be out there, but I'm not aware of it.
Okay, well, we're getting at 12:50, so I'll do like 3 or 4 more short questions, and then we'll wrap up. So thanks everyone for your patience. Everyone's still here, so I appreciate it. I know this is interesting, and it's obviously important to you if you're here. What is the evidence for right now cerebral spinal fluid, plasma tau in patients with CTE? How are we getting there?
Yeah, I think that's probably our one of the biggest promised areas for developing a diagnostic, or at least something that can help inform. And so we've been partnering with a team in Sweden, which is really kind of the world's leaders in detecting different epitopes in CSF, and mostly it's related around tau. I think that's going to be helpful, but of course there's a big overlap with Alzheimer's disease, and so distinguishing those two is going to be a little bit tricky. But we're close to finding some epitopes that may be a little bit different between the two diseases, and so hopefully we'll have some progress in that area. Yeah.
One of our brain donor families, Shannon Stanke, is asking a question, and I think I would know the answer. Does REM sleep behavior disorder associated with CTE manifest with the same symptoms as described in the Mayo Clinic? I think questionnaire, and I think the answer would be, we don't know, right? Because it hasn't been studied yet. We don't know what CTE or tau-mediated RBD, how those symptoms might be different than classical REM behavior disorder. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we used a very modified version, just asked a couple questions to identify it, but we have not gone in depth to tease apart any subtle differences between the disorders, which I think is an important next step.
Yeah, and then a question about violence. So we're talking about sort of a violent activity while you're sleeping. What's the state of the science right now on understanding if there's a relationship between CTE and violence in life while you're awake?
Yeah, pretty minimal. I don't think we have a good sense of that, and it's a difficult study to do, and to do properly controlled. It again needs numbers, and it has not yet been done.
Right. So, and that's one of those things that anecdotally, a lot of the people that have passed away and had their brain studied, so many of them had violent deaths. There's people who have murdered other people. And there's people who had late onset in their life violence with their families. And we thank the families who have shared that information with us. But you have to have real numbers to do a scientific study, understanding if CT was the cause of that or other behaviors. So certainly if you look at the anatomy of the brain and places where you see the damage, it's possible that the degeneration of the brain is creating a lack of inhibition, and so when you just got angry before, now you're getting violent. But we want to be careful about saying, that connection, because more work needs to be done. But certainly we all know those stories. And so we need to investigate that. It's important for the families. So, all right. So I thank you guys for all your questions. I know we were jumping between complicated science and clinical questions and everything. So I appreciate your patience. I want to thank our Dr. Stein and Jason Adams again for joining us. Great job on the paper. Thank you, and thank everybody in your labs and everyone on the team who co-authored that paper for all their hard work. Thank the families who are on this, whose family members were part of this study. We appreciate it very much.